Military officials say Israel struck more than 2,500 targets in Gaza so far. More than 680 Palestinians were reported dead. The Hamas spokesman claimed that 4 Israelis who'd been taken hostage had been killed in the airstrikes, a claim we are yet to independently verify. But Hamas is still firing back. Missiles are being launched at Jerusalem, Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv and Ashkelon. Israel's Iron Dome defence system is doing its job, intercepting many of those rockets, but some have got through. And all the while, the Israelis still counting and recovering the dead. At least 900 Israelis were killed this weekend, including at least 260 at this music festival. And beyond that, 100 Israelis are still being held inside Gaza, their fate unknown. In the last half an hour, we've heard from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He compared Hamas to ISIS, and he warned Hamas that these strikes are just the beginning of Israel's retaliation. We'll have all the analysis tonight, reaction from the region, and we will look at the failings of intelligence in Israel and the alleged complacency from Israel's allies in Washington. But let's start our coverage in Ashkelon at the end of a very busy day for our colleague Anna Foster, who's just got back to the hotel. Quite a day. We saw that in our headlines, Anna. What have you seen while you've been out and about?
Well, Christian, it might seem a little strange to see me sort of here in full helmet and body armour, but a lot of what we've seen today has been an almost constant barrage of missiles coming across from Gaza. Last night, the sound out here was just extraordinary all night. Today, we've been in the bomb shelter twice, actually, while we've been just in the hotel. I say bomb shelter, but often you're looking at a stairway, somewhere to get underground. And this is happening not just here in Ashkelon, which is one of the southern Israeli communities that's right around the fence around Gaza, but in different communities, as you were saying, heading towards Israel, Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv. This has been happening regularly. But also, again, we hear the continuing sound of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, targeting Gaza as well. Airstrikes that, again, happen through the night and through the day. They say that they've been targeting Hamas command posts. They say that they've also targeted a Palestinian Islamic Jihad command post. And this has a huge impact on people's lives. I just want to take you back to where we were a little bit earlier in the day. This was around about lunchtime in Ashkelon.
There's a huge barrage going on overhead just at the moment. We have taken cover. This is it's actually a memorial building. You can see we're all here in the there's Nick.
Guys,
he's got a camera. Yeah, we're gonna move. Get down. When the sirens started, I was talking to Gilad. He'd been at the music festival where more than 250 people were massacred as Hamas launched its attack on Saturday morning. Shrapnel tore past his head. He was lucky to survive.
The bullet went through here and through out here.
So it went in. Yeah, you can see it went in and out.
Yeah.
People living here know these moments of fear well. Gilad and his mother didn't need words. We followed the smoke. We think this is where one of the missiles hit. Yeah, look, here in the ground. Avi and Anat's building doesn't have a bomb shelter, so the family hid in a stairwell. They told the children the explosions were thunder. We need to be strong for them, Avi told me, but who's going to take care of us?
Yeah, so difficult for families on both sides, actually, who were trapped in the midst of this fighting. They say they've secured the border towns today, the Israeli Defense Force, Anna, but I know there were pictures of more militants coming through that fence overnight. Is there still a concern in that area that maybe Hamas fighters are still in southern Israel and could reappear?
Oh, there is. Yeah, Christy. I mean, there's a big concern. I mean, certainly yesterday, when I was still in Ashkelon, there's a sort of point that you can get to where the army have sealed off the highway, and they sort of have it as a sealed off military zone beyond that, so you can't go any further. But on the road, there was a body lying there, believed to have been a Hamas militant who'd been shot dead. And when we were back there today, 24 hours later, that body was still lying in the road, only just being recovered. And when you talk to people here, a lot of them are concerned. They say there's been a report of something happening in this community. Have you heard that people have got as far as Jerusalem? They talk about potential tunnels under here. So people are genuinely concerned, because remember, this is something that they haven't seen here for, I was going to say, for such a long time. You're looking really at the Yom Kippur War in 1973. They are used to missile strikes. They are used to missiles coming in from Gaza. But what they are not used to is this sort of ground offensive that we saw, this infiltration by Hamas militants coming through the fence and attacking people where they stood, attacking people in their homes. This massacre that we saw at the music festival where more than 250 people were killed, where Gilad was, and he was saying there just how terrifying the situation was. And all of this taken together, it gives you a sense of a population that is shocked, is stunned, is in some ways disbelieving that the Israeli intelligence services did not spot this with their partners like the US, for example, Israel's biggest and most important ally, that they didn't spot this and that they didn't prevent it. And it is one of the biggest things that people are talking about right now.
We just watched Benjamin Netanyahu, no confirmation that there will be a ground offensive, but are you seeing down there the massing of heavy machinery, howitzers, tanks? Does it look to you like it's the preparation for a ground offensive?
Well, I saw that today, and I saw a lot of it. It was all together. The guns were trained on Gaza. They looked like they were parked in a formation, ready to go. While I was there, we saw the delivery of big tanks, big diesel tanks that were there to fuel the military vehicles. So from that point of view, yes, it did. It looked like they were putting everything in place for a potential ground offensive. But of course, it's really, really difficult. It's delicate for a few reasons. Now, one is that we know there are at least 100 Israeli hostages inside Gaza. It is so densely populated. It's one of the most densely populated places on earth. And any kind of ground offensive in there would have an enormous impact on the civilian community. So you're looking at Palestinian civilians, women, children who live there, who have nowhere to go. They can't leave Gaza because the area, the perimeter of Gaza, is controlled by the Israelis. So there's nowhere that they can go if there is a ground offensive. But the prospect of civilian casualties will be high, but also the prospect of injury to these Israeli hostages that have been taken to Gaza as well. So while Israel wants to show a significant show of force, and Benjamin Netanyahu has said that more than once, while they want to exact a price on Hamas for doing this, there are a lot of very fine, very delicate things that need to be taken into account while they decide what they do want to do next.
Yeah, Prime Minister tonight naming a minister for hostages who will be in charge of negotiating and planning their rescue from the Gaza Strip. Anna, thank you very much. You stay safe. Thank you for joining us tonight at the end of such a long day. Let's speak to Ibrahim Jalal. He's a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. Ibrahim, we've just been talking about the repeated cycle of violence, really. This is the fourth conflict since 2005, since the Israelis unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. How does this operation compare, do you think?
I think the recent escalation at a time when Ukraine's international response continues unraveling shows the scale of moral crisis, where as a result of the failure to break the cycle of peace deadlock, obviously, normalization waves and systematic double standards did project violence. It could be seen as a reaction, but particularly the latest escalation marks the most significant event potentially over the past 50 years, an intelligence failure and a change in rules of engagement. And it obviously reflects the enduring complexity of protracted and resolved and instead deepening multi-layered grievances, particularly of the Palestinians. Of course, while the loss of human lives and indiscriminate targeting across territories is very alarming and tragic, this latest escalation does not operate in a vacuum. It's part of a broader story of conflict and occupation that has, went beyond the failure to reach a two-state solution based on UNSC Resolution 242 And the latest triggers might have contributed, such as violence at Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan, continuous expansion of settlements, displacement of Palestinians, continued siege of Gaza, and potentially the eroding space for life necessities and opportunities. And I think it's a state of war. It has been a state of war for so long. But there must be a change in the rules of the formula of peace and the dividends that it brings, because that's the only way forward. The cycle of conflict must be frozen, and that requires acknowledgement of some of the grievances, including the potential formation of a Palestinian state, because the status quo, as we've seen in the past 2 decades or even the past 7, is not sustainable. So
but that also requires a partner for peace, doesn't it? And a partner that does not want the destruction of Israel as a state, and that is what Hamas talks of. Can I ask you about whether this actually stems from Hamas's isolation? Because we've had the Abraham Accords, the bilateral agreements between Israel, Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE. There was one in the offing with Saudi Arabia, which the Saudi Arabians were seemingly quite positive about. And the Palestinians had got very little back in terms of concessions. Was this Hamas trying to put the brakes on that, even if that might lead to the eventual destruction of the group?
I think you bring a very important point, and what has been attempted to be done here is recentering the primacy of the Palestinian cause, amid what you rightly mentioned, the wave of normalization, which has, put maybe less concessions for the Palestinians, and that, has been driven by, as you said, overlooking the Palestinians or even the actively engaged actors, including the military wings. And that sense of isolation through the exclusion of primary stakeholders, but also the prioritization of normalization, thinking that would be the way forward, did exhibit clear limits and might have complicated matters further, in a sense that we saw this very escalation take place. And the other point that you mentioned about potential partner for peace, I think there is a peace crisis across, from the Netanyahu regime to, a wide range of Palestinian stakeholders, given the lack of vision for what they actually want to see as a final product. And that, is a lengthy process, but it requires constant engagement and directory engagement rather than the prioritization of normalization wave, thinking that the Palestinian cause and grievances, and equally the quest for peace that offers dividends for everyone, is put behind. I think that's a very big challenge, and part of it is the motive, as you rightly mentioned.
Yeah. OK, we'll have to leave it there. Ibrahim Jalal, thank you very much for that. There has been an extraordinary level of deception here. Hamas was somehow able to mislead Israel for months. And what is extraordinary is that this attack, which was timed to coincide with the Jewish Sabbath and a religious holiday, was a secret even within Gaza. We're told many Hamas leaders were unaware of the plans. Even the fighters, around 1,000 of them, who were deployed in the assault, had no inkling of what they were being trained for. When the day came, the operation divided into 4 parts. First of that was the barrage of 3,000 rockets fired from Gaza. That coincided with these incursions by fighters who flew in on hang gliders or motorised paragliders over the border. The fighters used explosives to breach the barriers and then sped across on motorbikes. Bulldozers widened the gaps. More fighters entered in 4-wheeled vehicles, while a commando unit attacked the Army's southern Gaza headquarters and jammed its communications. So don't underestimate how this will be playing within Israel. The one job the Israeli government has is to protect its people. How did they not see this coming? Let's speak then to Richard Pate, who I think is there. Are you there, Richard?
Sure, I'm with you.
Richard, thank you very much. You served, Richard, with the IDF, and of course you've advised the Israeli government in the past, so you're well placed to tell us how this came about. How was there such an intelligence failure on the part of the Israelis?
So before we talk about the intelligence failure, I think we need to understand kind of the situation that Israel was with regard to Hamas just up until a week ago. In fact, I think the modus operandi for the last 2 or 3 years has been a misconception that Hamas were actually interested in governance. They were interested in improving the lives, the economy and the lives of Gazans. And therefore, Israel was in a a dialogue, an indirect dialogue, mostly facilitated by Egypt. But on the agenda up until a week ago was the idea of expanding work permits for Gazans, improving the access of import and exports, expanding the fishing zone. All of this idea that even though Hamas has a very radical agenda, that they have some pragmatism to it, and that's kind of blew up quite literally in Israel's faces. That they thought there was a dialogue, but that completely failed. Now, in terms of the intelligence failure, this will go into an inquiry after the event. There was also an operational failure, as you mentioned just now in your opening. The sophistication of the attack, the fact that they sent in drones to target the camera surveillance and the antennae responsible for the communication system. They were able then to enter the base, but therefore then was able to open the gates that allowed the vehicles to come in. Was a very sophisticated, complicated attack. There's also criticism that the level of deployment of Israeli forces wasn't nearly enough to reflect the potential of this, because Israel just did not see this coming.
That tells me, having worked in Gaza and having worked in Rafah on the Egyptian side, that there's still an awful lot of stuff coming through the tunnels and through the border. And one suspects that is coming from Iran. We know that they are financially supportive of Hamas. We know that they arm Hamas. Did we know that they had the sort of equipment that was used on Saturday?
I think a lot of it took Israel by surprise. I mean, there is smuggling through the tunnels network. Don't forget, that Gaza also has a border with Egypt, so that's where the main smuggling. There is also the sea route that, although the Israeli Navy patrols the sea, there are some incidents where they've been able to successfully smuggle via the sea. And the third route, they take advantage of the humanitarian corridor that Israel constantly supplies through the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is the freeway crossing between Israel, Egypt, and the Gaza Strip. And so it's quite possible that some of this technology and the equipment, the drones, for example, could have been smuggled in through ostensible kind of goods that were there going into to help service the civilian population, and that Hamas has used that loophole to gain access to such technology.
It's a very densely populated area, Gaza, tight, narrow streets. There are young men and women who are now massed on the northern border. You've served in a mechanised brigade. You know what will be going through their mind. Put us in the position of some of those young Israelis tonight, what they'll be thinking sitting there and what they might be facing.
Well, I'll tell you from my own experience in the Israeli military is that training is so intense and comprehensive that thankfully when it comes to active combat, I would describe it as controlled aggression. Everyone knows their job. There is kind of a set protocol of commands that people have been drilled through. So people will be ready for this. And I'll also say a word about the senior commanders, because there's a lot of speculation right now whether we're on the cusp of a land invasion as well. I think at the moment they've waited the 48 hours since the initial operation. I believe that cool heads will prevail, that they will only launch that operation if it has very meetable military targets of incapacitating Hamas, of demilitarizing them and destroying the military leadership. And
can I just jump in there, Richard? How do you do that? Because we're going to talk to the family of one of the hostages in a second. How do you do that while reassuring the family that you are doing everything you can to protect the hostages?
It's a good question. That the same question that we're asking amongst ourselves as well. One hopes that the combination of intelligence planning has an idea, although it's the assessment is that these hostages have already been spread out and proliferated across the Gaza Strip. It's quite likely that they're being there as human shields protecting precious strategic strong points for Hamas. So this is going to be very difficult, a very complicated operation, which is also why I don't think Israel will rush into it. The other aspect, of course, is that Israel faces a threat on multiple fronts. We saw already minimal engagement from Hezbollah this morning in the north, from Lebanon. That's a theatre which we will also need to monitor very carefully indeed in the days ahead.
Richard, really good to get your insight. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
So what about the hostages then? There was a warning tonight from Hamas that it will begin killing hostages and televising it if the attacks on Palestinians continue. Dreadful for the families, of course, who are watching these pictures and thinking about those who are missing. This is footage that was posted on Telegram over the weekend. This is 25-year-old Noah Argamani, kidnapped by fighters on a motorbike, screaming for help as she's taken away. The video then pans across the road to another group of militants you'll see in a second. There you go, holding Miss Argamani's boyfriend. He is Avinatan Or, whose arms you can see are pinned behind his back. Let's speak to Ahmed Papara. He's a friend of Avinatan and Noah. Thank you for coming on the programme tonight, and our sympathies with you and everyone who knows them for what you're going through at the moment. What have you had any information from the Israeli government? Have they told you what their plans are and how they might attempt to rescue your friends?
Well, there hasn't been any official contact. The thing is, you need to understand the governments have a lot of issues on their mind, and I'm pretty sure that if they have any plans or of rescuing or issuing any negotiation, it's not something that civilians would know and should know. I think confidentiality is very important here about these measurements. They have their ways. The only thing we can do is talk to you, to the press, to make to get support about saving them.
You know them very well. How will they process this? How will they deal with an immensely pressured situation?
They are strong people. They are strong. You know, we in Israel, we suffer a lot. It's not the first war any of us have been through. Of course, this is the largest event we can remember. Of course, it's something that hasn't happened, I think, ever in Israel, in the history of Israel. And this is pretty horrifying, but we are strong people as we go through the army and we see and feel things about stuff that happened. And I'm pretty sure that they'll handle it well. They know us, and they know we'll do everything to get them back.
Obviously, you may just have heard Richard Pater. There is obviously a pressure on the Israeli government to deconstruct Hamas, to demolish military sites in Gaza. Hamas said today that 4 hostages have been killed, with no independent verification of that, and of course they would say that. But what is your message to the Israeli government in terms of how they plot this, how they carry out this operation in a way that might preserve the life of the hostages?
Again, I'll say it again. The thing is that the government has more information about everything that we can even consider. I don't think there should be any civilian thoughts about this, because we can't really know the full picture of what happens. I'm pretty sure they don't want anyone to be killed, and we support the government to make the right decisions for them and for us.
Ahmed Papara, thank you for being with us. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warns airstrikes in Gaza are just the beginning as the country orders tanks to the border for what it calls a complete siege of the Gaza Strip. The number of Israelis killed in attacks since Saturday has passed 900. Gaza Strip is now coming under intense aerial bombardment with more than 680 people dead. Just a couple of diplomatic lines to bring you from the last few minutes while we've been on air. The White House intelligence chief, John Kirby, says Iran is complicit in this attack, but there is no direct evidence that they know of at this moment tying it to attacks. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal today that there was a meeting between Hamas and Iran security officials from Iran last week, but at the moment the White House saying no direct link. The other interesting line is that the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have spoken, calling for a voice of reason to prevail in the ongoing war. We'll get to both those issues over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, but let's get a little bit more on today's fighting. This is the scene live now in Gaza. Dark at the moment, of course. but we have occasionally, intermittently, seen missiles lighting up the night sky tonight. All quiet at the moment. We will keep an eye on that throughout the programme for you. First, so here is the latest from the ground. Our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. He's in Ashkelon and sent this report on Israel's response.
Israel's military operation to eliminate the threat inside its own territory still isn't over. This afternoon, near the border with Gaza, more Israeli troops being sent in to clear out pockets of Hamas fighters. Their surprise attack that shattered any image of Israel's invincibility. Up to 1,000 Palestinian militants broke through the fences and barriers supposed to contain them. On this road, evidence that many have now been killed. But 3 days on, and some are still fighting. This road is littered with the bodies of Hamas fighters and burnt out, smashed up vehicles like this that they were using when they infiltrated across the border. You can hear gunfire still going on here. They are still clearing the area, the Israeli forces, smoke rising in the distance, Apaches overhead. This clear-up operation is still not over.
You need to go to Shuba. You cannot be here. It's dangerous for you.
The military block access to no-go areas. And still regularly coming under attack by mortar and rocket fire. Checkpoints turning back vehicles, and anxious locals still shocked by what's happened.
They slaughtered children and the elderly, people who can't defend themselves. They're not fighting for anything other than to kill.
This the aftermath after just one Hamas massacre. The place where hundreds of young people who'd come to party in the desert were murdered. The scale, even for Israel, which has experienced plenty of violence, unprecedented.
It is by far the worst day in Israeli history. Never before have so many Israelis been killed by one single thing, let alone enemy activity on one day. And if you're Americans and want to compare this to something in American history, then this could be a 9/11 and a Pearl Harbor wrapped into one.
Israeli jets have already conducted hundreds of retaliatory strikes inside Gaza. The small Palestinian enclave, home to more than 2 million people. They too, now caught up in this war. This woman screaming, "They're destroying us," after an Israeli bomb hit a mosque nearby. And this may just be the prelude of worse to come. Israel's already tightening the noose around Gaza.
We are imposing a complete siege on the city of Gaza. There will be no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and are acting accordingly.
Israel is also massing its forces. Tanks, armoured vehicles and troops. Overnight, Israel has been building up its forces here near the border with Gaza in what looks like preparations for a potential major military operation inside Gaza itself. Israel's response will reverberate around the region. What it does next will have an impact way beyond Gaza's border. Jonathan Beale, BBC News, Southern Israel.
Yeah, no confirmation from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the last hour that there will be a ground offensive, but you see from Jonathan's pictures there at the southern border that certainly there is a build-up of the heavy weaponry, the howitzers, the tanks ready in preparation for a ground incursion. Just a statement in the last few minutes from Hamas saying they will not negotiate over the Israeli captives while under fire. Some of the earlier statements, in fact, from the Qassam brigades, the armed military wing of Hamas earlier today, saying that they would start killing hostages if the Israelis continued to target civilians inside Gaza. Let's talk about that line I brought you just a few minutes ago from the White House. John Kirby on the intelligence side, saying that they do not see any direct evidence of Iran's involvement at this moment. Iran and Israel, of course, sworn enemies. No secret that Tehran arms, finances and protects Hamas leaders, so it should come as no surprise that serious questions are being asked in Washington of what role Iran has played in this attack. The Wall Street Journal reported today that last Monday, Iran's security officials met with Hamas leaders in Beirut and gave the group the green light. The Iranian mission to the UN today denied any knowledge of what Hamas was planning, though Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, has publicly congratulated the Hamas militants and called on other Islamic nations to join the fight. So let's speak then to Hussein Ibish. He's a senior resident scholar with the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. So what do you make of that statement from the White House, Hussein, given what we had from the Wall Street Journal earlier in the day?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt among analytical thinkers who follow Middle Eastern events that Hamas was heavily influenced by Iran, that there were probably Quds Force commanders, Iranian advisors in Gaza helping to plan this, since the summer. I think the Wall Street Journal story about a series of meetings in Beirut and a final decision to go ahead in August makes perfect sense. It all scans with everything we know. Hamas broke with Iran during the decade of the Arab Spring uprisings between 2010 and about 2019, when there was this sectarian split between Sunnis and Shiites throughout the region. But since 2019 or so, it's been much easier for Hamas to really get back into the Iranian orbit. And I think one of the many goals here is for Iran to resurrect what it used to call the axis of resistance, that included Sunni groups like Hamas, but also Shiite groups like Hezbollah and the PMF groups in Iraq, the Syrian government, which is Alawite-led, and all under the Iranian umbrella. And I think this is one of the goals. So yeah, Iran, without a doubt, is a major factor in this.
Obviously, you can add to that the negotiation with the Saudis that's ongoing, this bilateral agreement.
That's the main motivation for Iranian.
Of course. Yes. I mean, John Kirby's saying tonight he doesn't deny that Iran is complicit in this because we know how close the links are. Yeah. He's just not seeing direct evidence at the moment. And I'm just wondering whether at all you are concerned that there is this push on the right to blame Iran, because we know what the fallout of that would be. If Tehran was under pressure, then they would activate their other proxy in the region, and that is Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon.
Well, I think but I don't think criticism or rhetoric is going to drive Iran to do that. It's a real threat. But I think the Hamas attack is kind of designed to create a cascading series of events that could lead to such an eventuality. So what they're hoping for, I think, in the short run, is for the violence to spread into the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to inspire people, whoever it is in the West Bank or Gaza, with arms, with the capability of striking at Israel, to do that. And I think they're hoping that Israel's overreaction, that its doctrine of disproportionality is going to kick in, and they're going to commit all kinds of atrocities in Gaza, both from the air and on the ground, and that this will inspire outrage in the West Bank and Palestinian solidarity, and there'll be violence there too. At that point, it becomes easier for Hezbollah to step in and say they are defending the Al-Aqsa Mosque, East Jerusalem, the holy places there. And it's all baked in because Hamas has already branded this as the Al-Aqsa flood or the Al-Aqsa operation. So they're already trying to link this entirely Gaza-based and southern Israel-based violence to Jerusalem. Why? Because it tugs at heartstrings of Muslims all the way to Indonesia and Nigeria, and they want to create the conditions where Hezbollah can intervene, start firing missiles without, with some kind of a justification to other Lebanese. And that could plunge Israel into a multi-front war, fighting enemies to the south, to the east, and the north. And at that point, Israel must decide to take the war to its source and strike directly at Iran. So this cascading series of events is potentially extremely dangerous.
Well, extremely so. A battle group brought into the region, the General Forward strike group, is now heading towards that part of the Mediterranean. What will the message be from the White House, from the administration this evening? I mean, they're obviously in very close collaboration with the Israelis, but they will not want a conflagration that drags in Iran and the wider region, will they?
Right. No, not at all. And in addition to that military augmentation, that naval intensification with that deployment, which is aimed at Hezbollah. It's aimed at warning Hezbollah not to act. It's not aimed at Hamas. It's not even aimed at Iran. It's aimed at Hezbollah. I think in addition to that, there's going to be a lot of working the phones. I think the administration is talking to Egypt, which has a dialogue with Hamas because of the border. It's talking to Qatar, which has warm ties with Hamas and pays the bills in Gaza. It pays the employees of the Gaza local government, which is Hamas's payroll. Basically, it's not its military payroll, but the people who work for the government, the de facto government they run, and others who can talk to Hamas and to Hezbollah and say, look, guys, this is a very dangerous situation. You have to understand we're taking this seriously. We're here militarily, and you have to exercise restraint or you might end up dealing with us. It's not just the Israelis you have to worry about. The United States is here and we have their back. And that's part of the message.
That's
to
really
contain the situation.
Really interesting. Thank you for joining us this evening. I much appreciate your time.
You're very welcome.
Well, make no mistake, as Hussein says, this is having an enormously destabilising effect in neighbouring countries, particularly those bordering Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan. The Egyptian president is in election mode right now, bidding for a third term in December, and he will know what anger and resentment this stirs in his country, where the Muslim Brotherhood were previously a force. On Sunday, a policeman shot dead 2 Israelis and their Egyptian guide at a tourist site in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. And there have been several protests this weekend in the Jordan Valley close to the Palestinian territories. It tends to be the governments that call for calm while the people call for a response. But how long can President Sisi keep the gates at Rafah closed as the hospitals in Gaza fill up, the Israeli blockade tightens, and the refugee pressure at the border begins to mount? Let's speak to Stephen Cook. He's a senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies Institute at the Council on Foreign Relations. He joins me from Washington. Thank you for being with us this evening, Stephen. President Sisi will see the risk in this, won't he? They tend to have the Muslim Brotherhood under control, but they are aligned with Hamas, and there will be a lot of anger, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula right now, what's happening across their border.
There are risks all around for President Sisi, who, as you pointed out, is standing for elections such as they are in Egypt. But he has to be very careful about the way he positions himself on this. And that's why you see that the Egyptians are once again offering their services to mediate. That's been a traditional role for them, to go into the Gaza Strip and work with Hamas and put pressure on Hamas. At the same time, other organs of the state are engaged in all kinds of propaganda and fulminating against the Israelis. In the early 2000s, and around the time of the Second Intifada, Palestinian solidarity groups emerged all over Egypt. Those groups eventually morphed into the groups that became those who instigated the uprising against Hosni Mubarak in February 2011. So there's only so much that Sisi must feel that he can allow for popular anger and popular protest against what the Israelis are doing, while at the same time trying to be constructive in the Gaza Strip.
When I was in Rafah on the Egyptian side in 2008, there were a lot of ambulances that came through as the hospitals overflowed. The nearby town of El Arish was taking, particularly the children, the most seriously injured children, and there was aid flowing the other way. But I've heard Israelis today saying we want to finish Gaza altogether. Sisi should open the borders to Egypt and let the refugees flow through. That's not likely to happen, is it?
No, the Egyptians live in fear that the Israelis are going to dump Gaza on their lap. There may be viewers who don't remember that Gaza used to be actually Egyptian occupied territory until the June 1967 war. Israelis have described Gaza to me as the poison chalice of that victory, and they have been trying to give it away for decades. They went so far as to trying to give it to Yasser Arafat, their arch enemy, and over time they have said, "Oh, Gaza is an Arab problem. Gaza is an Arab problem," and in Cairo, that means that it raises alarm bells that the Israelis are trying to dump Gaza on them. That's why, even in the face of a humanitarian disaster and the coming of significant numbers of Palestinian civilian casualties, the Egyptians are going to be quite reluctant to swing those gates open because they fear that they'll never close and that Gaza will become their problem and the Israelis will be able to wash their hands of it.
The big powers have talked tonight. Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Crown Prince and President Al-Sisi have spoken, and they've talked about a voice of reason prevailing in the region. There's no sign of that from Prime Minister Netanyahu tonight. He's talking about a long campaign. How much risk does that pose to what Washington wanted to achieve in this bilateral agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Is there a risk that that is now dead and buried?
Well, I think reason is in short supply, and that begins with Hamas and Mohammed Deif, the military leader, who, when he talks about the longest occupation in the world, isn't talking about the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. He is talking about liberating all of Palestine, as fantastical as that may sound. There's not a lot of reason in Tehran. The Israelis are obviously wounded and hurt and vengeful right now. So yes, broadly speaking, there isn't a lot of reason that is going on. And that's why whatever the Crown Prince and President Sisi might want to do, whatever offers there are to de-escalate, whatever the Turkish government says about a peace process, that's not likely to gain any traction anytime in the near future. Everybody should prepare themselves for what the Israelis are saying is likely to be a long, hard-fought battle.
But the question with that, though, Stephen, I mean, the question with a long, hard battle is to what end, and how do you replace Hamas? And it really brings me to my other question: is where does this leave Fatah in the West Bank? I mean, corrupt, not trusted by the Palestinians, living in the West Bank, not really an alternative to Hamas. So where is the Palestinian leadership if you behead Hamas and take control of Gaza?
Well, certainly the Fatah leadership and Palestinian Authority has become essentially irrelevant, and that is part of the problem, and that is also on the Israelis, who have spent years and years undermining the Palestinian Authority. When it comes to Gaza, there are really no easy answers here what to do beyond Hamas. But I think it's clear, and I think Israeli leaders have made it clear that they are no longer prepared to live with Hamas. The difference between now and a decade ago, 2014, 49-day battle, when the Egyptians actually were encouraging the Israelis to destroy Hamas, the Israelis said no, they wouldn't, because they feared what would come next, and they didn't want to become responsible. But after the large number of Israeli casualties, you have to go back to October 1973 to find anything approximating the number of Israeli casualties in 24 hours. And in 1973, it was all soldiers. Now, on Saturday and Sunday, it was soldiers as well as civilians who were killed, 700 of them, which is a huge, huge number in Israel. I think Israeli leaders have made it clear that they no longer want to abide by the old rules and that the destruction of Hamas is apparent. What comes next, that is quite worrying, because it's not clear that they have thought through what that is. But I suspect that what the Israelis are going to find is that, one, this is going to be difficult. And if, in fact, that remains their strategic goal, they're going to find themselves in a place where they don't want to be, which is back in Gaza for a longer period of time than they may intend.
Yeah, they left that well alone in 2005. I don't think they want to be the occupiers again. Stephen, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Good to talk to you. Stephen Cook there from the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, while all this is happening, the US House of Representatives is paralysed without a speaker. We asked that question on this programme last week. What happens if there's a crisis? Well, here is the crisis. And currently there's no vote scheduled to replace the speaker, which means extra military aid for Israel can't be approved and sent as quickly as Tel Aviv would like. Then there's a notable lack of diplomatic presence on the ground. Because of the now broken confirmation process within Congress, the United States is currently without an ambassador in Israel, in Egypt, Lebanon, Oman, Kuwait. There is no State Department coordinator for terrorism. The United States may be promising a forceful response through the Pentagon, but diplomatically in the region, they are certainly under strength. And that is the result of the poisonous atmosphere in Washington. Let's go to to Washington and talk with Leanne Caldwell from the Washington Post. Robbie Gramer, national security reporter for the Foreign Policy magazine, is also with us. Leanne, good to see you. Thanks for coming on. I've been watching Kevin McCarthy on and off today talking about the situation. I mean, I suppose he would say this because he was deposed, but he did warn that something like this might happen, and here they are, stuck without a speaker.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so without a speaker, the House of Representatives can't really do much. But there's also no precedent here. So there's not a lot of rules that have been written. There's some who think that they should ignore the fact that there's no speaker and move anyway. But we'll see. All of this is currently being discussed. But Kevin McCarthy what he's doing is perhaps even using this crisis as a reason to say why he should be reinstated as speaker. That's going to be a top level of discussion this week on who the next Speaker of the House is going to be. And a lot of people are using this, the crisis in Israel, as a reason that people should act expeditiously.
But no vote imminent then, Leanne.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking hours, we're talking days, are we?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Expeditiously means the earliest it could do is Wednesday. You know, and we could take a step back here. The House of Representatives and Congress, in the immediate sense, there's not a lot for them to do. There was a briefing with some top lawmakers on Capitol Hill last night by administration officials. It was unclassified. And the administration is saying they still have $100 million of drawdown potential to give to the Israelis if they need it. But there will be a supplemental request coming, they think, in days, maybe early next week. The administration is trying to figure out what that is. And so, you know, if this speaker's fight drags out into next week, that's when it gets really complicated, and that's when it could be extremely damaging. The administration and Congress thinks they can get through this week, but any longer than that, there's lots of questions.
Robbie, it was your tweet that reminded me just how poorly represented Washington is right now in the region. I mean, it speaks more broadly about the way they've taken their eye off the Middle East in general, doesn't it? I mean, how under strength are they, and why is that relevant?
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show, you know, that the United States keeps trying to quit the Middle East, but the Middle East won't let the United States quit here. This comes at a time when the Biden administration has really been trying to extricate itself from the region, focus on competing with China, focus on Russia and the war in Ukraine. And they were caught flat-footed, as well as their ally Israel, obviously, with this massive attack. And they just have a thin bench of senior presidentially nominated, Senate confirmed positions in the region. As you mentioned, no ambassadors in key capitals, including Israel and Egypt, no top counterterrorism envoy. And this is because of this largely new and unprecedented sweeping blockade of nominees by certain Republican lawmakers in the Senate today that are pumping the brakes on getting all of these senior national security positions filled and out there at a time when it's really needed.
Robbie, just in terms of the battle group that's on its way, I mean, from the Pentagon perspective, they want to rearm Israel so that they can keep operating the Iron Dome system. I presume there'll be PSYOPs cover from the aircraft that are on board the Gerald Ford. Are they fulfilling a gap in Israeli intelligence or in Israeli capability at the minute?
You know, I think it's too soon to tell at this point. Everyone's still in scramble mode. Here in Washington, there seems to be two focuses for the Biden administration. The first is delivering as much support to Israel as possible. And as we discussed, that's really difficult now without the House Speaker, unclear the path for funding forward and getting this carrier strike group out there.
Yeah.
And the second is really damage control mode, making sure this doesn't spiral into a full-scale war, including Hezbollah, Iran, or Syria. And that's where these senior diplomats could really be used.
Robbie, sorry to squeeze you. We're just up against a break, but thank you very much for that. Robbie and Leanne, lovely to have you both on the programme. We are going to go to a short break. The other side, of course, we'll have our panel here, talk plenty more about the situation in Gaza. Stay with us.